I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight on the Missouri River steamboating. And I have to confess, I'm the one that thought of this idea, persuaded him to do it. I used to live in Fergus County. I floated the Missouri River twice, and I've always been fascinated with the steamboat era. It was a lively time, and it formed a very important connection until the railroad took over the transportation. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever, raise your hand if you've ever floated the Missouri River? Look at that, Ken. You got some friends out there. So I'll read this introduction and then give a few of my own personal words. Ken Robison is a chronicler of neglected Western history and loves sharing history stories with people. He served, pardon? Okay. He serves as historian at the Overholser Historic Research Center in Fort Benton. If you haven't been to the museums in Fort Benton where he has an office and works, you should go to Fort Benton. They have so many things, or you could spend half a day to a day looking at all of their things that they have there. Continuing on, he's a trustee of the board, on the board of the Montana Historical Society. The society has honored Ken as a Montana Heritage Keeper. Montana native Captain Ken Robison, he served 29 years in naval intelligence during the Cold War, and he's the author or co-author of 16 books, most recently, The Historic Tales of Fort Benton and Cold War Montana. We're welcoming him back. He was here last year. Take it away, Ken. Thank you.
Let me test the mic. Can you hear me in back okay?
Louder, maybe.
Do we need to turn the sound up? No. Okay. Well, I'll pick up on one of the things Lee said, and that is the only thing I know of that was good about that miserable COVID period is that it forced a lot of Montanans to travel within Montana, and so many from Kalispell and Missoula and the west of the mountains came across the Rocky Mountains for their very first time. Many of them came to Fort Benton. We had great times talking about history. But anyway, it's not that long a drive. Come over and take advantage of those museums in Fort Benton. So it's just thrilling to me to see a town with a history group like the 4HistoryBuffs that can draw a crowd. I guess you can now see the images over on that side. I didn't know there was a shade to come down over there. I was beginning to worry that you wouldn't see much of the images. But let's talk about steamboating first, and then let's move on to a little bit beyond steamboating that's also within this Yankees and Rebels on the Upper Missouri. This book was kind of my third of a trilogy that started during the 150th anniversary of the greatest event in American history, the Civil War. And I began that with the first book. The second book came out that focused on Confederates, although the first one did as well. And then I hadn't done enough with steamboats, and I also had a whole bunch of stories that I wanted to tell that related to either the Civil War directly or to the immediate aftermath. That whole great steamboating period began really during the Civil War, but it was so thoroughly disrupted that it really didn't take off until 1865, 66. But let's go hop on board the steamboat Chippewa and go up the Missouri River in that transformational summer of 1860 when three events transpired to set the stage for massive change on the upper Missouri, deep in the heart of Blackfoot country. In the span of 1 month, the first ever steamboats arrived at the Fort Benton levee, bringing a brigade, about 300 recruits, dragoon recruits, the first military unit after Lewis and Clark. And they went into camp by the old fur trading fort. 2 weeks after they got there, another military, quasi-military unit, the Captain William Reynolds expedition that had spent the previous summer in the Yellowstone Basin exploring that amazing part of what's now Montana. And they wintered over in northern Wyoming and then came down the Missouri and arrived at Fort Benton about mid-July. And then, of course, as Kim Brigham and Bill Weichel and those of us that attend the Mullen Road conferences, whether they're in Fort Benton or as they were last year in Missoula or this year in Spokane, as we all know from that summer of 1860, specifically the 1st of August of 1860, John Mullen and his main part of his expedition arrived at Fort Benton, completing the construction of a military wagon road that came right through later Missoula. In fact, you even have roads here named Mullen Road, so you know a lot about it. But that 624-mile wagon road was completed, and shortly after, of course, the recruits, the dragoons, organized, got underway, and became the first and really the last big military users because hot on the heels of all that in 1860 was the 1861 beginning of the Civil War. So this is one of my favorite images. I've talked about Gustav Sohn in the past and the remarkable talents that he had, not least of which was as an artist. He was also a linguist and interpreter and did many things and did them all well. And he did this drawing. He was with Mullen, and so he drew this. Of course, he wasn't here when the steamboats arrived, and there weren't three, there were actually two, and so on, but that's good artistic license. So let's join Lieutenant August Couch of the 1st Dragoons on board the Chippewa as they were making their way up through the upper Missouri to Fort Benton. Couch, a German immigrant and an exceptional Army officer, left us with the finest account of this important trip and the first military use of the Mullen Road. Quote, "A week before our arrival, the scenery began to dramatically improve. On June 27th, we discovered signs of Indians and soon came on a large encampment of Pagan Blackfeet. We stopped, and Colonel Vaughn, the Indian agent, gave them quite a present of flour and bread. The scenery was exquisitely beautiful. The hills are of clay with various slats of lime, magnesium, and soda effervescing on their surface. They have been formed by the water and are perfectly destitute of vegetation except on the summit some scattered pines. 2 days later, we entered a different character of scenery, of the most beautiful castellated character in the white sandstone that composed the bluffs. On our last day steam from Fort Benton, our steamer was pushed to its limits. We were steaming up the narrow Missouri, the paddle wheel churning a white plume in its wake. We fed her fires with cracker boxes, pork barrels, and everything combustible that we could spare that was on board. This made the old boat shake and palpitate like a wind-broken horse. Many of us who'd experienced the steamboat races on the old Mississippi enjoyed a taste of that old excitement. At this point, the Missouri was only 100 yards wide, with the current running hard and strong. In the midst of this final dash to Fort Benton, a soldier fell overboard, and the carpenter from the boat drowned while trying to save the soldier, so both were lost. As our Key West and Chippewa hove into view of Fort Benton, we were greeted with cheers and a scattering of shots fired in the air, a most worthy greeting for the arrival of the first steamboats ever to moor at the old trading post. There it is. But now let's fast forward a year to 1861, just as the Civil War was beginning, first with Fort Sumter in April, and then on the 10th of May, a fascinating, bold action took place in St. Louis, the Camp Jackson affair. But we'll leave that for another day, except to say that if that action hadn't taken place and the Missouri State Guard, which was in camp at Camp Jackson, hadn't been captured as if they were Confederate prisoners of war, that Missouri State Guard may well have taken Missouri into the Confederacy. So you hear a lot about Sumter, but you don't hear much about Camp Jackson, but it was a critical event just 1 month afterward. And just as all that was happening, let's join John Mason Brown, a real adventurer, as he began the first of his 2 trips to the upper Missouri during 1861 and 1862. Brown adventured west before becoming embroiled in the Civil War in his native Kentucky, where he joined the Union Army and led his Kentucky Cavalry Regiment into combat against the notorious Confederate cavalry leader, General John Hunt Morgan. On Mason's first trip up the Missouri on the steamboats Chippewa and Spread Eagle in 1861, Brown became friends with Andrew Dawson, the chief factor at the trading post in Fort Benton, the American Fur Company post, and the successor to Alexander Culbertson there. Brown, with other adventurous travelers during that 2-month river trip, also met Charles P. Shoto, who was the head of the American Fur Company operation out of St. Louis. And also on board was that colorful trader that became pretty famous or infamous later on, and that's Malcolm Clark. So, oh my gosh, how would you like to spend an evening in the salon first having your dinner and then having whatever imbibing in afterward with Shoto and Dawson and Malcolm Clark? My gosh. John Mason Brown was born in Frankfort, Kentucky in 1837 in imposing Liberty Hall that's shown here. That hall was built for his grandfather, John Brown, a leading lawyer and one of Kentucky's first 2 senators. John Mason Brown's father, Mason, was a substantial landowner and slaveholder, holding 51 slaves in 1860 and wielding considerable political influence. Young John Mason, though, graduated from Yale College in 1856, returned to Frankfurt where he taught school and studied law. And then in April 1860, he opened a law practice in St. Louis. During Brown's first trip up the Missouri in that spring of 1861, on the Spread Eagle steamboat traveling in company with the Chippewa, he had long conversations and made good friends with Andrew Dawson, as well as those other frontiersmen. During this trip, Dawson wrote, in St. Louis, there was not a pistol to be had for love or money. Nothing is talked of but soldiering. And even here on the steamboat, the passengers have formed themselves into a company and go daily through drills. The 15 Spread Eagle Guards, organized by John Mason Brown, were armed with government annuity rifles provided by Charles Choteau. Those arms, of course, were being taken upriver for distribution under treaty obligation to the various tribes as part of the annuities. Throughout this trip, Brown kept a remarkable diary that contained daily entries describing the many hazards of the trip up the river, his travels throughout what later became the Western Montana Territory, as well as geographical features of the Rocky Mountains. Boarding the smaller steamer Chippewa at Fort Union, which of course is right at the Montana-North Dakota border today, the travelers soon faced disaster. A careless crewman, striving to imbibe liquor stored in the dark hold, dropped a candle, igniting the alcohol and eventually spreading to the 200 kegs of gunpowder that were stored there, and the boat eventually blew up. Before that, quick action by the crew beached the Chippewa long enough for Brown, his friends, artist William de la Mornay, Carey, and Major William Schifflin, and the other passengers to scramble ashore. Brown described the disaster as it unfolded. We were smoking our after-dinner pipes when the cry, "Fire!" was raised below. The rush and excitement was terrifying, but the boat being near shore, a hawser was gotten ahead, and after some delay, the human freight landed safely. I managed to save my gun, pistol, overcoat, valise, blankets, besides various property of others. The boat floated down after the hawser burned, and the powder exploded with a tremendous noise. Boat and cargo total loss. This appeared to be just the sort of adventure that John Mason Brown craved, and after locating horses, he and his companions started overland for Fort Benton, arriving after a series of incidents over a 17-day period. After being entertained at Fort Benton by factor Andrew Dawson, Brown then traveled along the Mullen Military Wagon Road via the Blackfeet Government Farm at Sun River Crossing. And along the way, he described the Sun River as the most beautiful stream he'd ever seen, large, bold, cold as ice, fed from the Rocky Mountain snows, and swarming with trout. Along the way, Brown wrote extensively of his travels on the road, meeting and riding with Captain John Mullen, who was, of course, after completing the road in 1816, for the next 2 years, they did additional work each summer. So Mullen was back on the road, and there was John Mason Brown riding with him at St. Regis de Borgia, and describing conditions on the road, observing the indigenous tribes, the violence, the quest for gold, and the deeply divided loyalties of the white residents as news would arrive about the war. Brown continued on to Fort Walla Walla and then to San Francisco and home via the California overland route. Another young adventurer on board Chippewa on that trip was the artist Carey, who combined his sense of adventure with a talent for both writing and lively, realistic painting. Carey shares a tale about his first sketch on this trip up the Missouri River. Quote, "Pretty near the first sketch I made got me in a mess. Taking the opportunity of a short wooding stop on this trip up the Missouri, I arranged to sketch a native girl whom I saw standing near a teepee. To add color to the scene, I placed a colorful blanket about her shoulders. As I did that, a nearby native woman shouted excitedly and ran to me and made several strange motions over me. When the whistle blew for departure, I returned to the Chippewa, but the frantic movement on shore continued. A trapper who understood the native sign language informed me that I had just gone through a wedding ceremony with the Indian girl. I was horrified, but then the whistle blew again and I hopped aboard. I reasoned that if getting married was as easy as all that, divorce should be just as simple. And fortunately, artist Carey was along to capture this scene as the Chippewa blew up, just as the passengers had made it off to safety. A third member of that party of adventurers was Major William Schiffling, whose description of the Chippewa disaster was much more colorful than either Brown or Carey could muster up. Matter of fact, Schiffling's writings appeared through a series of articles in a wonderful turn of the 19th century publication called Recreation Magazine, and this is part of one of them. One beautiful Sunday evening after supper, while we were enjoying our smoke on the upper deck, a cry of fire was raised, and on going forward we saw smoke pouring from the forward hatch. One of the crew, being thirsty, gone below, and you know the story. As we all knew, he has 300, not 200, but 300 kegs of powder in the hold of the boat. So we did, and we didn't want to stay on board long. A panic ensued. The shouts and screams of the people and the columns of smoke and flame leaping from the hold up the open hatchways were enough to shake the nerves of the bravest men. Several of us rushed to our staterooms, grabbed our rifles and other equipment, and prepared to escape at the first opportunity. The engineer stood at his post and ran the boat ashore. Our captain, Sam Humphreys, had the instinct of self-preservation strongly developed. He stood on the bow in his shirt sleeves without a package of any kind in hand, and as soon as the boat got within 6 feet of land, he leaped like a wild man, the captain abandoning ship. In doing so, he pushed the frail little steamer out further into the water again, but the engineer drove her up to the shore and held her there until all the passengers were safely off. Then he, too, went ashore, and we all left the vessel as fast as possible. We took refuge behind some large cottonwoods. There are the cottonwoods. At a safe distance and watched the fated craft float helplessly out into the stream. In about 20 minutes, the fire reached the powder, and the unfortunate Chippewa went up in a cloud of smoke. We could see the lighter wreckage floating down the river. Among it, we could recognize a choice saddle, a bundle of goods, heavy blankets, some strong, serviceable clothing. Oh, how we shivered as we thought how cold we'd be next fall without that material that was floating down the river. But alas, it's now at the bottom of the Big Muddy, food for the vulgar turtles and catfish. Still, we knew there was no use crying over lost jelly, and there were many, many jars of mint jelly for the venison and for the buffalo steaks. The next day, some of the men went down along the riverbank below the scene of the explosion, picked up cans of roasted oysters, tomatoes, chunks of roast pork, corned beef, etc. The trees along the bank were festooned with annuity blankets and bolts of red flannel and red cloth, cotton cloth, all badly scorched. Both Indians and whites helped themselves to these. There was a wild scramble to see who could get the most. Some valuable goods were thus rescued. Fortunately, we found an old flatboat near here that belonged to the fur company. We rigged a shelter or awning over this and returned it down to Fort Union. Luckily for us, there was an Indian camp near from which we obtained buffalo meat, or we might have starved. After that, the Civil War severely disrupted steamboat traffic on the Missouri River, as I write about in Yankees and Rebels. There were problems with Quantrill's raiders and other Confederate groups, Bill Anderson and other raiders. And the low water years of that wartime period, there were 3 years in a row, ending in 1865, that had light winter snow, and therefore the June rises were not the great rise they depended on for the steamboat. So it made steamboating tough in those years. And I think it's, some boats made it through, especially in 1864 and certainly in 1865. And in 65, a flood of steamboats gathered at St. Louis Levee preparing to go to the mountains. The war was near an end. It was under control along the river. The Union had total control of the rivers at that point. And the gold camps at Alder Gulch and Bannock and Last Chance Gulch needed minor supplies and all sorts of goods. For context, in 1865, Montana's placer gold mines yielded some $18 million in 1865 dollars. Now it's over 300 million. The dawn of the golden era of steamboat navigation was opening at Fort Benton, the head of navigation on the Missouri. Yet as the spring of 1865 dawned, Fort Benton was in turmoil. The American Fur Company trading post on the upper river had been sold to the Northwest Fur Company. The streets of Fort Benton were becoming the bloodiest block in the West. Incidents between native Blackfeet and white settlers along the Benton to Helena, the old Mullen Road, were increasing. A new town at the mouth of the Marias River, just about 20 miles downriver from Fort Benton, was being planned and the early stages of being built, so that Fort Benton would be cut out of the steamboat trade. They'd end at the Marias. But in the midst of all that, on May 25th, the work party of 10 woodcutters who were providing the logs for the first buildings were killed by Calf Shirt and his Kainai Blackfoot. The stage was set for heavy demand at the gold camps, but very tough navigation on the river. Of the 23 steamboats that departed St. Louis in that spring of 1865 bound for Fort Benton, just 3 would land at the levee. 5 if you count 3 trips by one of them, but it was 3 different steamboats. 16 steamers would be forced to offload cargo and passengers downriver, with 7 of those reaching that mouth of the Marias landing. 4 more of these valuable steamers, each worth about $40,000, would be snagged and lost to the hazards of the mighty Missouri. Corps Number 2, EO Standard, Twilight, and the Bertrand. This is the tragic story of the steamboat Bertrand, a story that remarkably lives on today. The Civil War was just 8 days from the dramatic surrender of Lee at Appomattox and his Army of Northern Virginia, when on April 1st, the new construction Copeland Line steamboat Bertrand struck an underwater tree stump, snagged and sunk in the morgue for Missouri River steamboats at DeSoto Bend, 50 river miles north of Omaha. Bound for Fort Benton, the Bertrand was heavily loaded with passengers and cargoes destined for the gold mining camps. Bertrand departed the St. Louis levee on Saturday, March 18th. For 6 weeks prior to the departure, the St. Louis newspapers were advertising "Ho for the gold mines of Idaho, Montana," and the Montana and Idaho transportation line will provide new and elegant steamer Bertrand, who's going to depart for the gold regions on the opening of navigation. The Bertrand is a very light draft, fast boat with fine accommodations. The ads enticed shippers and passengers seeking transportation to Fort Benton, Virginia City, Deer Lodge, and the Bitter Valley. The steamer Bertrand is of light draft with a good carrying capacity and excellent cabin accommodations, ensuring to freighter and travelers that speed and safety so essential on a trip of this kind. Shippers may rely upon this as being one of the first boats to Benton. So with part owner and Captain James Yore at the helm, a crew of more than 20, about 28 passengers, and a full cargo of 250 tons, the Bertrand got underway. The collapse of Confederate resistance in the Missouri ensured that, unlike the previous 3 years, the passage would be peaceful. There would be no threat from guerrillas. Captain Yore went ashore to spend the night in Omaha at the Herndon House, the town's most prestigious hotel, as he prepared to return to Missoula and to St. Louis, and he was relieved by a very experienced captain, Horace Bixby. And at daybreak, the morning of April 1st, the Bertrand got underway under Bixby. The stretch of the Missouri River above Omaha was treacherous and slow going. By 3 o'clock on a clear, warm afternoon, the steamer was nearly 25 miles or 50 river miles north of Omaha at DeSoto Bend, when a shocking jolt gripped the hold and the passengers. speed and safety be damned. The Bertrand struck a submerged log amidships on the port side. Taking on water, this great painting, by the way, is by a Fort Benton artist, Jim Trott, who kind of specialized in painting steamboats. Some of the finest upper Missouri River steamboat scenes are done by this James Trott. In fact, we're going to have a major exhibit of his paintings in Fort Benton in 2016. This year, by the way, we have a great exhibit of Lee Silliman's bison collection, his collection of lithographs and images of the American bison over the many decades is probably the finest ever assembled. And of course, in his very professional hand, Lee has them. Even the worst lithograph looks pristine and absolutely perfect. So they're on display in Fort Benton starting today when our museum's open until the end of October for the summer. Taking on water, the Bertrand beached on a sandbar about 30 feet from the bank. Some passengers jumped overboard and swam ashore. When the boat stabilized, the crew launched the yawl, loaded with passengers, and then swung the loading plank ashore so remaining passengers could make their way ashore with no loss of life. Safe but shaken, passenger Caroline Barrows Mitland, a mother traveling with 2 small children, wrote, quote, "In a moment, as it were, our peaceful little home was changed into fright, confusion, and almost despair. Our plans for the future were all changed, and each was eager to save himself from the muddy waters of the Missouri River." Montanans first learned of the catastrophe through the pages of the Montana Post on April 27th. Steamboat sunk. The steamboat Bertrand sunk above Omaha while on her voyage hither. The passengers, among whom were Mrs. Atchison, Mrs. Milford, with their children, are all safe and sound, but they've lost all their baggage. The cargo was nearly all insured. We learn from Mr. R. Simpson that General Doris, one of the pioneer merchants, lost by this accident a part of the goods he was bringing to Virginia City. This short account gives a glimpse of the passengers and the valuable cargo aboard. This image shows the Bertrand traveling exhibit that we've displayed at both the 2015 and 2022 Mullen Road conferences in Fort Benton. While all 28 known passengers survived, their personal baggage and a stunning amount of cargo was lost. Among the passengers were 2 highly successful Virginia City merchants, John T. Murphy and General George Poole Doris, and the families of several others. John Murphy was already a thriving merchant in Virginia City, and on his eventual arrival this year, he'd form Murphy, Neal and Company in Helena and Fort Benton, and later formed Murphy McClay Hardware with McClay. In the words of historian Ronald Schweitzer, Murphy was one of those rare individuals who could touch anything and turn it to gold. Doris, on the other hand, had a darker past. After serving in the Black Hawk War in Illinois in 1832 and receiving the title of general from Illinois Governor Reynolds, General Doris settled in Platte City, Missouri. There he began trading in African-American slaves, receiving fabulous prices as he took large gangs of slaves from Missouri into the Deep South every few months. The onset of the Civil War ended that lucrative but brutal venture, and General Doris headed west to begin a mercantile business supplying mining equipment to Alder Gulch miners. Both Murphy and Doris had large consignments of goods on the Bertrand, as did Granville Stewart of Deer Lodge, Frank Warden of Hellgate, and John J. Rowe and Company. 16 women and children were aboard on the adventures of their lives. Wives, Atchison, Millard, and Walton, were all upper middle class women with children en route to the Montana frontier to join their husbands. Carolyn Millard's father, Willard Barrows, was also on board to bring his business experience to Virginia City. 2 young Campbell sisters, Annie, who celebrated her 21st birthday on the day the Bertrand sailed, and Fanny, age 18, were en route to join their father, Major James Campbell, in Gallatin City. The Campbell sisters were well educated and would make their mark on the new territory, teaching and ranching with future husbands. Most passengers proceeded up the Missouri within a few days aboard another Copeland line steamboat, the General Grant, finally reaching Fort Benton on board yet a third Copeland boat, the Deer Lodge. The Bertrand's cargo provided a time capsule containing a wealth of mid-19th century Americana. The story this cargo told is stunning, and it's presented today in exceptional displays of portions of the 300,000 artifacts that were salvaged in the 1960s at DeSoto Bend Wildlife Refuge north of Omaha. The early mining camps lacked, of course, farms and gardens, resulting in shortages in all manner of foodstuffs. The Bertrand was loaded not only with flour, sugar, potatoes, and other foodstuffs, but even exotic items like brandied peaches and cherries, sardines, and many other luxury items. Large amounts of textiles and leather goods, mining tools and equipment, a sawmill, nails, saws, locks, hand tools, and plows filled the steamer's hold. Military supplies were on board, including gunpowder and artillery balls and shells. Reportedly, some 5,000 gallons of whiskey were on board in oaken barrels. And as much as 35,000 pounds of mercury, quicksilver, worth about $250,000 today, was on board, and that was consigned to General Doris. He was able to salvage a good portion of that, and a fair portion of the booze was recovered. The Bertrand belonged to a new steamboat line, the Montana and Idaho Transportation Company. That had been formed the previous year, and it was owned principally by a wealthy St. Louis pork packer. He made his fortune during the Civil War, selling to the Union. And so the money came from John J. Rowe. His son-in-law gained experience through the Civil War, captaining steamboats during the war, and now he was managing this new Montana and Idaho Transportation Company. So John G. Copeland was the young man in charge of the transportation, the river transportation. The third part of their team was also had been a steamboat captain, Captain Nicholas Wall. Nick Wall was their man in Montana Territory. He came up the Missouri in 1862, set up a trading post first at Gold Creek and then moved it to Grasshopper Creek as soon as gold was struck there, then on the next year to Virginia City. Quite an operation, because you'd have one company sending their goods on their steamboats to Fort Benton, put on their wagons and their mule and ox teams, and taken all over the territory and sold in John J. Rowe and Company retail stores. It's an amazing operation. Most of the Bertrand's cargo was insured, and salvage operation, as I mentioned, got the two parts of it, but the rest was not recovered, and over time the Missouri changed course in that area, and where the Bertrand had gone down became a cornfield, and a couple of energetic archaeologists from St. Louis managed to work with the government since it was on government land, to open up the Bertrand. They couldn't salvage the boat because the wood was too far gone, but they brought that cargo out. And how many of you have been to the DeSoto Wildlife Refuge? It's an amazing trip north of Omaha. If you ever get down that way, do stop by. More than 400 steamboats were lost over time on the Missouri River. 9 of those steamboats, including the Chippewa, were lost in Montana Territory. The others that were lost were the Bighorn, Amelia Poe, Butte, Tacony, Red Cloud, John H. Trover, Peter Balin, and the Marion. These were lost, and then 3 others were lost on the Yellowstone River, the J.E. Rankin, Osceola, and the Yellowstone 3. So Yankees and Rebels serves as my tribute to steamboats during and after the Civil War. I talked some about those guerrilla operations against them and the use on the lower Missouri, just to give a full picture of steamboat operations during the Civil War. But I also talk about other things. One of my favorite things, and we won't talk about it tonight, but there were 8 former slave young black women who came up on steamboats, and some had amazing stories before they came up the river, such as Maria and Mary Adams, who had worked for Elizabeth Custer at the Custer household at Fort Abraham Lincoln near Bismarck, until George made his ill-fated expedition and was killed, of course. And Elizabeth had to give up those government quarters. That's military tradition. So she had to let Maria and Mary Adams go. Well, they heard things were booming on the upper Missouri, so they took a steamboat from Bismarck to Fort Benton, and they have great stories, both before they came and after they came, and the others as well. It was an opportunity to present a different side of steamboating. First of all, there aren't too many stories written by women about their experiences on the river. I've got one terrific one in one of my books, and then the stories of these young women. And then a couple of memorable characters. Kim Bergman was still with the Missoulian when Yankees and Rebels came out, and he kindly wrote a really nifty article about one of the chapters in it, and that chapter was about I was laying out the evidence, both pro and con, of whether Jesse and Frank James, the James brothers, had actually come to Montana Territory. There are persistent legends in the Highwood Mountain area and in the Deer Lodge Valley area that the James brothers were there. And so I dug into every bit of the evidence I could find and laid it all out in a chapter. Kim had a wonderful article about that in the Missoulian, and I had a talk at Fact and Fiction, and it was very popular. It's quite a story. But tonight, we're going to go on to a story that you may have just recently watched. How many of you saw that series called Manhunt? It's a story of the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. No one here saw it? They didn't show it in western Montana. Wow. Anyway, it just finished about a month ago, and it was, I think, eight-part series. And it was based on one of the better books. And it was a pretty high price, pretty well done, except the one flaw was that Lincoln was assassinated, right? They almost killed the Secretary of State Seward. They botched the attempt to kill the Secretary of Defense, and he lived. Well, they made the Secretary of Defense a far bigger role in the series. I mean, he directed the manhunt and he managed from afar. But in this series, they have him on horse chasing after John Wilkes Booth, and and it was a little annoying. The true story is in Yankees and Rebels. And the story is, we won't go into detail tonight, but the story is the real tactical leader, the guy in the field chasing John Wilkes Booth with the support of a New York cavalry outfit, a military outfit, is Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger. Conger had been wounded 3 times during the Civil War, and the 3rd time so badly they wouldn't let him go back on active duty. But what they did was assign Everton Conger to a brand new organization. So he was the number 2 man in the brand new Secret Service. They finally got around to creating a Secret Service to supposedly protect the president. Of course, they didn't protect Lincoln. He was assassinated. But Conger he led the chase, and it was a successful chase, except that one of the soldiers, a Canadian by birth, shot Booth when he didn't have to, and it was against orders. They wanted to capture him alive and so on. So we won't talk a lot about that, but let's talk a little about Everton Conger. After all this, when Rutherford B. Hayes was appointed president, he appointed Everton Conger to the Montana Territorial Supreme Court. And after he served a number of years on the court, he retired to Dillon into a private practice, and he died in Dillon, and he's buried in the cemetery at Dillon, Montana. This is the guy that led the greatest manhunt in American history. Absolutely amazing. So that's Everton Conger. And they tracked him down at Garrett's farm.
And I think that manhunt thing is on TV next week, on 28th or 29th on PBS.
I'm sorry.
That manhunt
Oh, yeah.
video, I think it's going to be on PBS next week.
Oh, good.
28th
Well,
or 9th.
be sure to watch it. I think they mentioned Everton Conger one time, It's TV. Anyway, I think with that, I wanted to quickly mention a couple of things coming up. Next weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday in Spokane will be the Mullen Road Conference. It was done beautifully here last year at Fort Missoula. It's a gathering of, sometimes it's as low as maybe 50, other times it can be up well above 100. And it's one of those sort of rare history gatherings that pulls some national, people will come from North Carolina or from Washington, D.C. I see an Arizona guy is one of the presenters, Ryan Shaw, who was his first association with the Mullen Road Conference was with us in Fort Benton when he was on active duty in the Army. So Ryan is coming. But anyway, it's Washington, Idaho, and Montana attending wherever that conference is, all the way from Fort Walla Walla to Fort Benton. If you want more information about it, I've got the schedule laying up here and a sheet on the side that has this so it's readable if anybody's really interested in going. The second thing I want to mention is, and I've got cards up here for this, grab one, 26th through 28th September. Kim Brigham and I are both trustees with the Montana Historical Society Board. Each year, there's a conference in late September. One year it'll be in Helena. The next year it'll be in Red Lodge or Missoula or Great Falls, as it's going to be this year. So it's a great gathering, about 300 serious history buffs from around Montana. You all would enjoy it a lot. The program will be out online in a couple of weeks. Registration can happen anytime during the summer and so on. So the Montana History Conference is a great event coming up. And I guess we can't fail to talk just briefly about one of the great developments that over the past 6 years or so from the legislature. For many years, there'd been an attempt to build on or build separately to the veteran and pioneer building that is called the Montana Historical Society in Helena. It's been kind of overwhelmed with the amount of art and the collections and so on. And finally, the legislature passed an appropriation that provided, I think, about $34 million, as long as more than $34 million would be raised privately. And at this point, I think we've raised about $105 million for two things. One is a brand new building that'll be primarily a museum, but also have about a 250 capacity meeting room. And then it will provide to totally bring up to date, rehab the old building where the research center has been in the past and will remain. It'll just move down to the main floor. If you've been to the Montana Historical Society, most of the displays will go over to the new building, and it's going to be spectacular. Kim and I, Kim's shown there, with the tour we had in April when we had a board meeting, and it's coming right along. The staff will be moving into the new building in July this year, but it won't be finished and open until about a year later. So it'll probably be toward the end of summer of 2025 when the Montana Heritage Center opens. And that name, Montana Heritage Center, will apply to both buildings. So the new building is just the portion of the new Montana Heritage Center. And I, of course, shamelessly have to throw up a photo of my latest book, which is Historic Tales of Fort Benton. It's pretty challenging to find 13 tales out of the hundreds of tales that have surrounded that town. I just wanted to read one short piece. This was over a century ago. The great historian Hiram Chittenden, who wrote books on the fur trade and on the Upper Missouri that are still they're about 120 years old, and they're still great history. A lot of history gets dated. Chittenden wrote great history, and it's still, and he wrote at that time, few, if any, towns in far west country possess so unique and varied a history as Fort Benton. The true historic career of Fort Benton did not embrace more than half a century. Yet in that brief space, it saw more romance, tragedy, and vigorous life than many a city 100 times its size and 10 times its age. So I take you up the Missouri on steamboats and walks along the bloody block of the West and a visit to the infamous Hoodoo Block, and we spent a night together gambling in Madame Mustache's saloon. It was called the Cosmopolitan, and so on. With that, I will be glad to answer questions. I've had one hearing aid go out, and I probably will need help with hearing the questions, if you would pull it.
I have a mic, and we're recording tonight, so if you have a question?
I've seen plenty of photos of the poles for like poling the steamboats through shallow areas. Do you have anything you can talk about with that? Because I've never even seen a photo of that in action. And
Polling?
yeah, poling, where they actually
Well,
kind of like insect legs almost pull themselves along.
Those poles that you're probably referring to are called grasshoppers, and they were forward on the boat, and if they came to it, I don't have a photo with me of it in operation, but it was pretty sophisticated operation with, if you'd come to a sandbar and need help easing your boat along through the sandbar, those long poles on either side would almost be like walking sticks. And something similar to that was used in the days when before steamboats, of course, they had keel boats. And the keel boats depended on everything but they didn't have paddle wheels, they didn't have engines. Keel boats had a combination of manpower, and the manpower was used in a couple of ways. Principally, it would be put about 20 of your men along the shore, preferably, in some places you couldn't do it on shore, so they'd be in shallow water with a line maybe about 1,000 feet long, and they'd literally pull that steamboat up a river like the Missouri River. Now the other way, especially on the lower Missouri, a keel boat, they'd have poles, different poles than you were talking about, but on either side of the keel boat, there'd be poles, and they'd literally, like you see on the Thames with the boating on the Thames, and they'd have a sail, but of course, usually you were coming against the wind when you were coming to Montana, but if the wind was favorable, you could put your sail up, and then you'd have oars, but keel boats were a tough way up.
At this time, in Montana history as the U.S. postal system was struggling to expand its service out west. Did any of these steamboats ever receive official government contracts to carry the mail?
Absolutely. Again, I don't have it with me, but there's an incredible photo. Haynes, the Dakota photographer that later settled in Yellowstone Park, Haynes made his first trip by steamboat to Montana Territory in 1880 on the steamboat Helena, and it had a U.S. mail sign on the side of the boat, and it had a contract. So, you know, sometimes it's visible when you see a steamboat photo, but they very much used the steamboats for... The worst problem with steamboats, especially in the 1860s, is that they were coming from St. Louis until the railroad was completed to, well, first to Omaha and then to Sioux City and then to Yankton and finally to Bismarck in the 1870s. Once I got to Bismarck, and some work had been done on the Missouri River, you could make up to 7 or 8 trips a year from Bismarck to Fort Benton. But if you were coming from St. Louis, some boats could make 2 trips, but usually it was a 1 trip a boat. So it wasn't a very dependable source for mail in those early years. It got better later.
Yeah, my question is, did the levee, that beautiful levee, exist before steamboats, or was it built up once steamboats came up, or
At Fort Benton?
At Fort Benton.
It's a natural levee, and I mean, people will talk about coming up to the dock at Fort Benton. Well, there never really was a dock. It was, you moored at the levee. And sometimes there'd be, well, the record was 9 steamboats there at one time, if you can imagine. And these are boats that are anywhere from about 200 to 350 tons and about 200 to 300 feet in length. I mean, those are huge boats. First of all, to think they got up the river, but then to have multiple ones at the levee. Sometimes they'd have, like the night that Thomas Francis Meagher went off, his G.A. Thompson was the steamboat he was on. It was the outer, it was moored alongside another boat, which was alongside the levee. So, you know, it would get so crowded they couldn't all have a slot right at the levee. They might have to moor side by side with another boat.
Another question?
You mentioned using poling as a means of getting over shallows. Was cordelling used on the upper river, and did any of the boats have a steam capstan?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Was cordelling used on the upper river?
Yes,
And did any of the upper river boats...
you mean during the keelboat era?
Pardon me?
Cordelling?
Yes.
Yeah, that was that technique with the line and the guys along the shore. And that was how you got above Fort Union to Fort Benton with keelboats. And the steamboat captains used to say later that they don't know how on earth the captains of those keelboats got their men to do it. It was just an incredibly brutal job. You might make 15 miles in a day, in a good day.
The cordelling with a steamboat
was often used on a dead man upstream
Oh.
and using the capstan
Oh, yeah.
on deck. And did any of the upper river boats have a steam capstan?
Yes, they did.
Other questions? Well, I have one, of course. In your pic, you had one painting where the front left of the steamboat was hit and it was sinking. When steamboats sink, do they go straight down because they're flat-keeled, or do they tip over like other ships?
They'd go down, I mean, they'd fill with, the hold would fill with
They
water.
just go
and
straight down,
they-
more or less?
Well, I mean, it depended on the current and the river conditions, but, so it wouldn't be static, it would be moving, but, and of course, it also depended on what they struck. If it was an underwater oak tree that managed to stay in place, it would sort of anchor the
Oh, okay.
boat, and the boat would go down. There were lots of hazards to steamboating, but on the other hand, I don't have with me exactly, but in the 1860s, typically, if you could get your $40,000 steamboat up to Fort Benton and back successfully, you'd pay for the boat. Now, if you made 2 trips, and a few of them did each summer, you had even more. But so a lot of boats were lost, not many on the upper river, only the 9 over the years in Montana Territory. But overall, from, on the Missouri River, a lot of boats were lost, but they were paying for themselves along the way. It was a very profitable operation.
Anything else?
Kim's got a question.
Ken, I think you mentioned the name of the captain of the Chippewa when it went down.
Humphrey,
Sam Humphreys. Do you know anything more about him?
not offhand.
Okay.
He was not one of the great captains. I doubt if, it's a good question. I've not heard his name in command of a boat after that one. So I think abandoning his boat probably did him in as he's often been called the Prince of the Upper Missouri, and it's Captain James McCreary, and it's after this 1860s period. McCreary, through the 1870s, took more boats to Fort Benton than any other captain. And just last Tuesday, when I was in our research center in Fort Benton, I had a query from a descendant of this Captain James McCreary. And it was really fun because I also had correspondence with a woman who lives in, she now lives in Nebraska, outside Omaha. But she, for about 8 years, has been working on a biography of Captain James McCreary. You hear about the famous ones like Captain Grant Marsh and his Far West, probably the most famous Upper Missouri and Yellowstone River steamboat captain, and you hear about Captain Joe LaBarge, who long before they could make it all the way to Fort Benton, of course, steamboats were bringing goods up to Fort Union. That was the upper post for the American Fur Company. Well, Joe LaBarge was a routine captain with those boats that were bringing supplies to the trading posts, and very colorful captain. He got in trouble with the Union during the Civil War because, like most of the steamboat captains, not Grant Marsh, but most of them, they were Southerners, and their loyalties were known by the Union. And so, I mean, the reason I think that the American Fur Company sold out at Fort Benton wasn't because the bison were disappearing that quickly, because this was 1865 when they bailed out of Fort Benton. But it was because the Shotos were a Southern family, and they'd had problems with the Union, and even though the war was ending, I think they wanted to get out of operating those trading posts. So. But the sad thing is that so many of those great steamboat captains, Grant Marsh is an exception, and Chittenden that I mentioned earlier wrote a great 2-volume on LaBarge and his upper Missouri steamboat operations. But most of those steamboat captains, including McCrory in the past, haven't had biographies, and you don't, unless you really go to some lengths to do research, you don't know that much about them. So fortunately, this Cassie Nelson, is her name, is within a year or so of finishing her long-awaited biography of McCrory, and I hope others will pick up and do some of the other captains. Except for the pilot. Wow, thank you. I guess that's it.